Well, good morning and welcome to Marquette University. My name is Dr. David Clark, and I'm the Executive Associate Dean in the College of Business Administration. So on behalf of the college, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the Milwaukee Blockchain Conference. Our Dean, Dr. Brian Till, is unfortunately out of town on business, so he can't join us today. But he also extends his warm welcome to the participants and the attendees. This is shaping up to be a great event. We do have a very impressive list of presenters and panelists and moderators, and they come from both industry and academia. They're certainly going to help shed some light on the significant role that blockchain technology will play in shaping the future path of business and the future path of the economy. This event is actually part of Milwaukee Startup Week, which was co-founded by 2011 Marquette College of Business alumni, that would be Matt Cordio, as well as Ed Javier. And so Ed's going to give us a little bit of overview of the Milwaukee Startup Week.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. I'm not going to use the mic, so hopefully you can hear me. Ed Javier, I'm co-founder of Startup Week. This is our second year. First time we did this was last year. We approached it like an entrepreneur and said, let's just do it, see what happens, and then from there we'll re-hit it and try to do things better from what we learned. We had 26 events last year in Milwaukee. This year we have over 50 events in Milwaukee. Plus, we decided, or we didn't decide, all the other cities in Wisconsin said, hey, let's do this in our town too. So now we have 10 cities in Wisconsin. So it's about 120 events with over 600 sessions happening this week. We're finally halfway through, so I'm a little tired. How many have already attended a Startup Week event? All right, after this, you can all raise your hands. Now, the reason we did this was to get the community together. And one, to show the community how big the startup ecosystem is, to educate and try to get our entrepreneurs all the resources that they need, because there's all these different organizations that touch entrepreneurs, from the universities all the way down to folks like at the Water Council. And this meeting here, I think, is the largest gathering now in Milwaukee for a blockchain event. And that you all got together. So we're looking forward to having more of these on this topic. And also thank you to Marquette University for being one of the event organizers for Startup Week.
Thank you, Ed. I do want to identify one of our co-sponsors for this conference, and that's the Marquette University Center for Cybersecurity Awareness and Cyber Defense. It's actually housed in the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's directed by Dr. Tom Kaczmarek. So a round of applause for them as well. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Monica Adia. She's going to serve as the MC for the program, and you're in good hands with Dr. Adia. She's chair of the management department. That's the biggest department in the college, and she's also a distinguished scholar and teacher. She teaches courses in information systems. So again, let me turn it over to Dr. Adia. Monica?
Thank you, Dave. That was a nicer introduction than I would have given myself, but thank you. Welcome, all of you. Good morning. And I joined Dave Clark, Dr. Till, as well as the Center for Cybersecurity in welcoming you to this event. I do want to say this event is being recorded, so links will be available at a later date. To give you a little bit of context as to how this event started, it was about 5-6 of us in a room, and we met specifically to say what's happening around blockchain, what's going on, where is this technology going, Where are Milwaukee companies in regards to adoption of this technology? And there was a wide range. There were clearly some companies that were leading edge, cutting edge in this technology. There are other companies that are saying, you know, we've heard about this. We don't know if this is a fit for us, which direction this is going. Is this hype? Is this kind of phasing out? By the way, we only knew of this as Bitcoin, and so where, you know, what is this? Where is this going? And so at that point, we said, you know, why not have an event, try to bring the community together, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, you know, we tried something that was in the right area, and thanks to you all, if you look around, this is a great success. We've had over 275 registrants for the event. You'll see them kind of coming in and out through the day. But thank you for making this event a big success. Without much ado, we'll begin the program with 2 presentations. On the program, we had 3 presenters in the first half of the day. Of the sessions. Unfortunately, Jennifer O'Rourke had to cancel because of illness. So we will have, first on is Mark West, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Fiserv. And Mark will present the business view of blockchain. In his role as CTO, Mark's responsibilities range from mobile, digital, and payments to core account processing and data services. Mark is also an entrepreneur in his own right and has served as a technical and business advisor to a range of startups. Mark will be followed by Dr. Lamont Black, who's assistant professor of finance at DePaul University. Dr. Black serves as the academic director for DePaul Center for Financial Services and as chair of the Banking Advisory Group for FinTech. Prior to joining DePaul, Dr. Black was an economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. He will present a brief history from Bitcoin to blockchain and will discuss outlooks and trends in this area. So I will step off. The two speakers will follow in sequence. After Mark, we will have about 10 minutes of QA with Mark, and then at that point, Dr. Black will step on and take the second round of presentations. So Mark, I know he was here somewhere. There you go. Welcome on board.
That was my trip to walk up on the stage. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Now, honestly, if they turn this off, yeah. Well, wait until I tell you the test at the end before you applaud. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, thank you for being here. This is an impressive crowd. You know, we've done a lot of conversations about many technology topics, mostly from a business view. You know, we talk a lot with banks and credit unions, right? You know, you think about banks and credit unions, you don't often think blockchain, or you don't often think innovation or anything other than, wow, they move really slow. They don't necessarily think about things that I care about, and they don't listen so well. Well, hopefully at the end of the conversation today, you'll at least take out a couple key points that says there's a lot of activity in the banking space. It's using innovation to better serve you as our customers. So let me give you the 1-minute Fiserv spiel for some background. I work for Jeff Yabuki, who's the CEO at Fiserv, which is kind of exciting but also challenging at the same time. I guess it'd be like having, you know, all of your tests delivered all at once and you have no time to study. So we move pretty fast. We are about 23,000 associates spread around the world, about $5.5 billion in revenue, and we solely focus in on financial institutions. Fiserv, financial institution service, that's what we do. There's a lot of interesting innovation out there. My role, as mentioned, I've done a lot of technology stuff. I've run some business units. I've done my own startups. One of them ended up being the largest mom's commerce site in the United States and community called Mamapedia. If you ever want to have an exciting entrepreneurial opportunity, go decide to start a mom community and get a lot of moms engaged on topics that matter to moms, and then offer them a discount coupon to a water park and see what fights come from that. Passionate engagement. So we're going to go through this presentation. If you turn to page 1 in your syllabus, we'll hit the high notes here. There will be a test at the end of it. I am going to do my darndest to not talk about Bitcoin. Somewhere underneath this all, there's a sense of humor, so if something comes across as odd, just assume that you meant to laugh. And if you don't laugh, well, you didn't get the joke. Okay, let's see. Yep, that's me. So I'm going to try not to read. The intent here is there's content to frame the discussion off of. The hope at the end of it is to leave you with a couple of key insights on how blockchain has evolved from being more an interesting idea from the corporate perspective, the business perspective, to something a bit more practical and purposeful. And we can talk about where Bitcoin fits into this as well as far as the mechanism of a blockchain. But I'd like to leave you with a couple of key thoughts on how this is actually being consumed, not just how it's designed. So there's a little bit in here on design, but most of it's going to be on how it's being consumed. Okay, so blockchain. How many of you really know what a blockchain is? Okay, now here's the next question. How many of you have Bitcoins? Okay, I'm going to come visit you guys. How many of you mine Bitcoins? Wow, there's some brave souls out there in the market. How many of you actually make money off of mining Bitcoins? There's some really smart people then. Okay, so I do own Bitcoins, and I've mined some Bitcoins as a hobby and discovered that I didn't have enough power coming into my garage to feed the machines. And then I did the math on the backside and said, unless it got to like $3,000, it was not going to be profitable. Okay, don't invest in my business plans. So I want to leave you, this slide's really important for a couple reasons. The actual technology behind Bitcoins and blockchains has been out there for a very, very, very long time. I used to build trading systems in the mid-1990s. And we encrypted data as it was moving between any location and also recorded in a thing called a ledger. And literally, think of a ledger as the good old green sheet, somebody sitting there hunched over, Ebenezer Scrooge in Christmas time with his quill pen out, recording stuff in a ledger. That's a blockchain. In a technology-delivered way, but that's a blockchain. We'll talk about that concept and how it unfolds and what it means, but the technology is not new. And anybody tells you the technology is new, please remind them that we've been encrypting things and storing them in ledgers for decades, and maybe even decades beyond that. So think of blockchain as a protocol. The way I like to describe it to some banking CEOs is, it's like the internet. It's not a product. You don't go down to the local Best Buy or go online to Amazon and buy something called the internet, right? You know, it's a box, you take it out, you slide the CD in, or maybe if you got one of those really non-mining machines, a good old floppy drive, you have one of those around. It's a protocol. It establishes the way that things are recorded and managed so that they pick up characteristics that are incredibly valuable. And we'll talk about those characteristics. So think of it just like the internet. It's a protocol. You use it to do something. It is not a database. It is not a game. It's a protocol, the core of it all. It's being tested quite a bit. So let me step back and kind of walk a 3-year journey with you. 3 years ago in the corporate world, blockchains were seen as interesting pieces of white paper literature that people would read and say, wow, that's kind of cool, and I'm really concerned about this Bitcoin thing. Because I don't know what it is. It's not real money. I don't understand it. Is it real money? The second year in the cycle, it kind of went to, we need to think about this because, boy, there's a lot of people putting a lot of capital into building things off of something called a blockchain. So Bitcoin proved that a blockchain wasn't hackable. You can steal Bitcoins all day long. A Bitcoin is just like, I know this is legacy stuff, real money. This is a Bitcoin. It has a token on it called the serial number. It's unique. It's evidenced in a ledger called the U.S. Treasury. This number is recorded. Because this number is recorded and a government stands behind it, sorry, I hope I'm not taking any of your lines, it's a fiat currency. I can use it and give it to you and you will assume it has this value, right? Bitcoin's the same way. It's a unique number. All it is a unique number. It's not backed by anything other than an implied value. And I'm going to leave the rest of that for that conversation. It's recorded in a blockchain, though. So that number sits in a ledger. that can be accessed by anybody or by only people that are permissioned to see that, and proven that that number has not been tampered with. Okay, that's a digital asset stored in a blockchain. It's a unique token, and it's evidence that it's not tampered with. Now, let's be really clear. A blockchain does not store data. I think there's been a big misnomer on blockchains. Blockchains are like a big database that really, no. A blockchain stores keys to get access to encrypted data. You don't put a lot of data into a blockchain. Did I remind you of the question we asked about how many of you are mining bitcoins? The compute power to encrypt and decrypt things in a blockchain exceeds the value of the data you would store in a blockchain, except for in very, very rare circumstances. It's really expensive. It's not as fast as a database, not as cheap as a database. It's a very expensive database. So I want to go to year 3 now, which is it's gone from, I need to understand it, to, we need to see about some pilot projects kind of point of, we need to have some view of what this thing is, to now, this year, starting 2017, you're seeing real pilots that are intended to move into the world we live in as usable product. So it's kind of matured now. It started to become something more practical, tactical. You can put it to work and get some value out of it that overcomes how much it will cost you. So we talked about transactions being recorded in a ledger. They're sealed cryptographically, so that way you have this visible way of knowing that nobody's touched it, changed it, and then what was put there is still true. And we'll talk about, there's 4 key values out of that. This was an Investor Business Daily 2016. That hasn't changed in the past year, which tells you blockchain's starting to mature. Because like every other week, these quotes were changing there for quite a while. Well, blockchain's this and it's that. It's really not. So we talk about the hash, the metadata. When you hear the term hash, that's quite literally the way that you encrypt and record that encrypted token. It's nothing more scary than that. I just have a unique number. Have any of you gone out to blockchain.info? Okay, I'd encourage you all to go look at blockchain.info just because you're looking at real live Bitcoins. You're only looking at one half of the crypto key or the hash. But that's what you're looking at, is a garbled set of numbers that are just recording on a screen. Those are Bitcoins being transacted. One other point on this. Ledgers can be full, limited, or private. So when you use the term ledger, you hear the term distributed ledger technology, DLT. You hear the term blockchain. You hear the term ledger. They're all the same thing. So limited, full means I can make a public open, like blockchain.info, website location that anybody can go take a number and query to see if that number is legitimate. Point 1. The other one, limited. Well, you know what? I only want a certain type of person to interact with this blockchain. People that work at Marquette, people that are students here. I want those people to have access to that. Kind of like the old MySpace model or Facebook private community model. Private. Private is it's not exposed to the public at all. That means you actually have the equivalent of a registration, login, control point that prevents you from going into the ledger. And this also has to do with permissions. So I can update it. I can add new content to it. I can do things within a rule set. We'll talk about the rule set in just a minute on smart contracts. All right. Now I got to get closer. See, I'm a walker and a talker. Okay, this slide here is probably the business slide that gets people a little bit like, okay, either I understand it or I don't. There are 4 things that a blockchain does. It does it really, really well. You notice I don't say store Bitcoins in there anywhere, right? It is fully integrated. So what does fully integrated mean? When you think about it from a business perspective, people in the business, well, let me use you. We're all human beings. We're all like, no aliens in the audience, I hope. You want your money to be safe, right? You want your money to be available. If somebody told you that your money was sitting out in a box on the edge of the street, what would you want to do? You'd want to go get it and secure it. You'd want to take it out of some way that it could be, could disappear. When we talk about time, risk, parties, controls, source of funds, when you're moving money or you're dealing with bank accounts, All of us care about knowing who had access to our account, who did what in our account, where's our money at, where did our money go to pay our bills, what did our credit card balance look like, all that stuff. Those are controls that sit against a blockchain ledger in a form called a smart contract. And those smart contracts are literally the rules that you will use to interact with the ledger. So I'm allowed to access a piece of information, it could be my bank balance, and I'm allowed to do things with it, like I can send it for a loan application, and I'm using banking terms. You could use it to pay a bill. Hey, I want to see I have money in my account, I want to transfer money over, and I want to pay a bill. Those are controls. Those controls are written in a contract way, and I'll explain why that contract matters a little bit more in just a minute. But you write rules like you would anything else. I don't want my brother to have access to my bank account. I'm sorry, he would, probably do something I don't really want him to do there. So those are controls. It's a single source of the truth. Remember I mentioned the Ebenezer Scrooge, one ledger? This is one ledger. Now, it does not mean there's only one big Uber ledger out there in the world. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of ledgers. These ledgers are built for a purpose. You need to think of them just like a ledger. You can have a ledger for banking. You can have a ledger for that bank. You can have a ledger for recording scores on a test here at the university. Great example. I could put those scores in a blockchain and give access to anybody that took that course out. Could also decide that allow the summaries of the scores, the averages and stuff like that, to be available to anybody. And can decide at the same time that data then will be made available for an application to have access to. Perhaps something that's aggregating scores for graduation or credit, right? Well, single source of the truth, you could have one for the management school, you could have one for the engineering school, you could have one for the art school if you wanted to. You could have one for the whole university. The rules would say who has access to do what and when with registry, with entries in the blockchain. And underneath it, the single source of the truth, there's an important point in bullet 3, which is one of the hallmarks that makes a blockchain different than a database. Immutability. I'll use a very specific example. Let me try to stay with the school example. Set of grades are published, and you don't want anybody going in and changing those grades. Maybe you might want to change your grades, but you don't want anybody changing your grades, right? So immutability is derived by something called consensus. Here's consensus. There are 4 administrators for that course. All 4 administrators will have to agree to change a grade, or the grade can't change. The thing about I created a token at a point in time and it was cryptographically signed, if all 4 people that have rights to access and put data into this ledger don't agree to make a change, the change cannot happen. So immutability, which is an important attribute of a blockchain, hugely important, it's the essence of trust, says, I posted a grade, and I need myself and 3 other parties, administrators, to agree that that grade can be changed. That's immutability. That's how Bitcoin exists in this world. They have things called miners out there. Those miners establish consensus. Those consensus say nobody's allowed to change that token in the blockchain without everybody agreeing on the miner side. That's also how they validate it. And I'm not giving you the exactly perfect technical description of it, because it goes into a little bit more hairy bits there. But the point is, without consensus, you don't make a change. You don't change history. You can't go back and say, the grade from last quarter was this, and I went and changed it because I had access to it, like you might in a traditional database. Why does that matter? Well, because of that and the encryption, parties that would not normally, companies that would not normally work together to share information are now sharing information. Because once it's put into a ledger, the keys are put into the ledger, the keys you use to get to the data. Once you put that in the ledger, unless everybody that's in that ledger agrees to make the change, it can't be changed. And that's actually evidenced cryptographically. It's like science, not like admin rights in an account. It's really important when you think about a blockchain and what makes it very different. And then because it's always encrypted and you can prove who had access to it, and you can't allow a change without consensus. Makes things a lot more effective. So let's get down to the simple things. What's the value? Greatly improves speed, security, transparency, and efficiency. Now, it says virtually anything of value. I mentioned you can store a bunch of data encrypted in a database and take the key and stick it in a blockchain and hand that key to anybody else. It's the same as handing them real money. Once you have that access to that key, once I transfer you that key, it is yours. It is just the same as giving diamonds or bearer bonds or dollars or pounds or euros, whatever your currency is. When you give somebody that, when I give you through a smart contract ownership of that asset, it is yours. There is no clawback. There is no oops. Okay? It is a registry. It records. It's a ledger. It tracks. When I give you control of whole or part of it, it is yours. I'll use an example. It's a really easy one that we go through. Safe deposit boxes. Any of you knows what those are still? Limited audience knows what a safe deposit box is. Anyway, you used to go to your bank, and in the bank they had a box on the wall with 2 keys on it. One the branch manager had, one you had. You got the box open, you put stuff in it, and then you sealed the box back up. And when you wanted access to it, what'd you do? You went back in with your key, and the branch manager showed up, and you put your key in, they put their key in, opened the box up, you took your stuff out. That's a ledger. I didn't say what was in the box. Here's the difference with the blockchain. I can mint a key that says, by the way, I'm going to mint a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, 10th, 100th key. And in that box, I have $100 bills. I have 100 $1 bills. I'm going to give you a key that will let you go take one of those dollars out of that box. In fact, I can specify which dollar if I wanted to through a smart contract. You show up with your key. His key works exactly like my key worked, except for in the blockchain, he only gets access to that $1 bill by serial number if I wanted to, that's been stored in the database, because I built a permissioned key that now I've given him control over. He can pick that dollar up whenever he wants. I have 99 left in the box. I can give 23 to you and 41 to you and maybe 3 cents to somebody else. It's a smart contract that lets you take the content of that safe deposit box, that blockchain, if you will, and parse it up and decide who has access to what and what those rules are. Oh, for you to get your dollar, by the way, you've got to give me 10. Okay? That's my rules. So if you give me $10, evidence you put $10 someplace and record it in a blockchain, I'll give you back your dollar. Cool, all day long. It's a good deal. So when we say about tracked and managed, it is much more about recording who has ownership, not the actual asset underneath it. You just want to keep drawing that out. It's a ledger. You record something in it. I can transfer that entry to somebody else. Okay? When they have it, it is theirs. Now, fortunately, because I know his public key, and I know who he is, and I know everything else, I can turn around and know it went to him. And because it's immutable, I can make sure that it didn't go to somebody else. And that, oh, by the way, it also got picked up, and nobody went back and rewrote history to say it wasn't picked up. So, our work to date. So we've done a lot of conversational explanations of blockchains. And we've done some pilots. I think I'm going to, maybe I don't know if I have an example in here, but we've done some pilots on how you do integrated borrowing, for example. We'll talk a little bit about that. We are right now, though, in working on 3 areas that we really think, and this is kind of like, not the exciting, I want to do, gaming on blockchain. These are practical and very purposeful, right? Identification, lending, and data recordation and sharing. Identification. You guys have a cybersecurity department here. I hope that somebody's waking up every morning and putting offers at the altar or something there. Cybersecurity is an insane area. It is like a crazy beyond nuts area of complex, very, very difficult to keep consensus engaged on who you are and what you have rights to do. And we're not here to talk about cybersecurity, but I will tell you right now, cybersecurity should wake all of us up at 2 o'clock in the morning, or 1:30 if you're not, 2 o'clock waker-upper. We are looking at ways to use blockchains because that immutability, that history over time, to start to build a consumer-centric identification mechanism. Most identification today is not consumer-centric. It's very application-centric. I have a login credential. I log into here. I do these things. I want to apply for a loan, and I have data from my other bank, but I can't get into the place where I'm applying for a loan without doing a bunch of copying of paper. Now, that's interesting, but you've got to know who the person is to begin with. Identification is very personal. It's about you, and it's about what you have access to or rights to have access to. We think there's a really great fit in there, and there's a lot of products in the market that are starting to move that way. But with that area, it's incredibly complex, and we're looking at it from a simplification and a know your customer, know your bank rule set. Very important. Lending. Lending is one of, that's another, again, if you get a theme through these three things: complex, pervasive, and very personal. So you apply for a loan at the bank, you need $1,000, and guess what? You get turned down, so what do? You fire your bank. They didn't do what you wanted them to do. Now, meanwhile, the bank probably has 3 other ways to get you that money. But because of the complexity of the banking system, you can't take all the information you put into that loan app and just move it to, like, maybe the debit card or credit card department and get an extension line of credit on your card. Can't do that because of the complexity of the underlying applications. Again, immutable, transparent, secure, trusted. Because of that, we can move between types of lending for the same customer. We think that's a really good way of taking a lot of friction out of the banking system. And then data recordation and sharing. You hear a lot about, well, I want to put my car title, I want to put my diploma when I graduate, my scores, I want to put my credit score someplace so I can share it with anybody. The truth of the matter is a blockchain can do that. Again, it's immutable, it's transparent, the way it's structured. You could do that. You could decide to share your information with another university for postgraduate studies. You could decide to apply for buying a car and take your FICO score from Credit Karma and make it real evidence that you actually have that credit score without having to go get it and pass it back through and have somebody check it. So there's a lot of benefit in that space. Number one is incredibly complex because it's personal, and it's very, very much at the center of things you own and things you know. People take that one really personally. Lending is transactional. That means you've got to do something complex and keep that evidence over time. And of course, data recordation and sharing really ties across the two. So hopefully the theme you get out of this is we're trying to solve for complex problems today where human beings or traditional technology isn't very effective, and do it in a scaled way so it simplifies the mess so you understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you expect from it. So the pilot's going on right now around that. That's the 3rd-year journey track here. So I'm going to share with you a quick demo, and then I'll open it up for questions, if that's okay. So we were, we're saying like this, all kind of like talking hand, waving hands. It's a blockchain, it's a ledger, it's, Ebenezer Scrooge. Some people leave with different views of discussions like this. Most people remember Ebenezer. That'll be on the test. So we said, look, this is all interesting, but how do you actually do something with it? So we said, we're going to sit down and figure out, I mentioned that lending example, and so we told this story of Charles. So we said, Charlie's been with Woodgrove Bank for 5 years. Charlie's a really great guy, Well, Charlie decides he needs to borrow $1,000 because he wants to, buy something. And so Charlie goes to his bank, and today when Charlie goes to his bank, he'd go in and online maybe, and he'd fill out a loan application, and here's all my information, and hit submit, and then, magically 5 minutes or 5 days later, an answer comes back, and Charlie gets no. Now, Charlie doesn't feel very good about that experience. So we said, well, what could we do to just take Charlie's data that he put into one loan application and work it across multiple loan mechanisms to get him the best outcome? So we went to a best outcome instead of a traditional just apply for a loan, apply for a credit card, take it, put some money up as a secured loan. So we did this. We said, let's think like a consumer instead of like a bank. And so we said, look, here's Charlie. I could show it to you on my phone, but I didn't want to do it live because live demos are sometimes interesting. So we said, borrow $1,000. I've done a lot of those. And here's where blockchain kicks in. we already have in the blockchain, because he has a bank account, phone numbers, addresses. We have a FICO score. Hey, by the way, we need some employment verification. So, Charlie goes and he's got two choices: take a photo of his pay stub, or he can go to ADP if he has that and download the data. In the blockchain, we store the data, though, as non-repudiated, meaning we sourced it from ADP and it hasn't been changed by ADP. And once you do that, we call it, it's validated. So it's usable for Loan App. So Charlie does this. It's really pretty much like you might see some stuff today. Kind of interesting. Boy. Okay, one more time. There you go. Here's where it gets a little interesting. On the left-hand side of this, you see 3 lines that say apply. At this point in time, I have shared no private information of Charlie's with anybody. None. Charlie could be me. Because the blockchain knows the attributes of the person, not the personal information. It says, hey, bank, I got one of your customers that's been a 5-year customer, have an average balance of $1,200 in their checking account, and they've got a card with you, and they're looking to borrow $1,000. Their FICO score is 580. It hasn't been any disclosure yet. I mentioned that for a reason. There's no need to disclose. No need to. You have verification. This is one of your customers. You have verification that they have a bank balance like this. You have verification this is their FICO score. So it's like legitimate verified information. What gets interesting is you can drop it across a third-party P2P loan. So if FICO score 580, Woodgrove doesn't want to lend to Charlie, guess what? FICO score 580 can be published out through a blockchain, made available to second market P2P lenders. And a P2P lender, without knowing it's Charlie, that has the same information. It's one of my customers. They've been there for 5 years. They've got a $1,200 balance. They've got a card with this person. Would you lend to them? Well, in this case here, the P2P lender came back and said, we lend to Charlie. Now, the bank couldn't, because they couldn't, the credit score tolerance didn't fit within what they needed to do, but the bank wanted to solve for Charlie's need. So now the bank, without giving up your personal information, can go out and shop a loan with third parties and get an answer back that, yeah, if what you told me is true, I would lend to this person like this. Now, it may not sound all that exciting, but if you're trying to get $1,000 and your bank is telling you, you got to apply here, and then if that doesn't work, you got to go here, and then, oh, by the way, your bank won't give your information up to a third party, so that way you have to go to a third party, like Lending Club or something like that, and make another application, that's not a very good experience. So while this is heavy tech, it's really about improving customer experience. Oh, now when he hits the accept button, the actual data is put into the loan application for the person that Charlie selected said, I'd like that offer. I'd like that offer. Now the stuff called PII, personally identifiable information, PCI, maybe your credit card information, is given out with your permission. With your permission. That's a big shift. All right, so let me see what else. Okay, so, yeah, he took the loan. Good for him. There's a lot of other content that's not in this deck. You might get a sense it's just a little bit, the story's not as smooth. Because I wanted to make sure you got a couple of things, and I'll just sum it up and we'll open it up for questions if that works time-wise. Okay. Blockchains are really cryptographically secured ledgers. They're the same thing as the Ebenezer Scrooges out there, except where they're done in a modern way with 256-bit encryption. And once you have that into play, it is not impossible, but it is near impossible. The compute power would normally exceed the value of what you'd be trying to take out of that blockchain to decrypt. It's very, 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 very compute intensive to crack that. Very compute intensive. Some people would say you can't, but I'd never say can't. It's moving from white papers and conversations to actual practical hands-on. There are players in the markets. You guys may have heard this rule. I don't know, but it's a rule that seems to hold true. It's a rule of 3. Usually when a market matures, you have 3 big players in a market, right? You've got 3 big players. You've got IBM with Hyperledger. You've got Microsoft doing their wonderful setup, which is interesting. We're not quite sure if it's a blockchain yet. And you have people like R3, Chain. We invested in Chain. We think Chain's got a really good fit in the financial services space, but maybe not in all spaces, right? They're probably not going to be an identity management platform, for example. So you're going to see this market start to consolidate to a group of 3 big leaders. It's just critical mass in the space. There are going to be a lot of experimentation still going on with startups in blockchain, solving for those complex problems I mentioned in there. By the way, in the startup world, at some point in time, startups do like to make money. And so you try to solve for a problem that can actually make money. That money may be, you're doing something because of a nonprofit, which is wonderful too. At some point in time, though, if, you need to be able to make money from it. So usually areas like this get a lot of investment, a lot of attention, because trillions of dollars sit in those 3 lines I mentioned: identity management, lending, data recordation, and sharing. Trillions of dollars. So I would just share with you that if you thought about the next phase of blockchain, you'll see a lot more around real-world, legitimate kind of applications that solve for problems that people think are valuable enough to solve for. It's kind of moved out of the experimentation stage. On the identities piece specifically, though, there are a couple of trends that are really interesting around you as a consumer, being able to take more control over your identification, who you are, and your data, the things that are personal to you. There's sites like civic.com, ID.me. There's a couple, like probably half a dozen sites out there like that right now, where this whole concept of identification is undergoing a very significant shift. And it's undergoing that shift because of blockchain. Because you have a place where you can record something that is immutable unless you get consensus to change it. And even then, most don't even allow consensus to occur. You have to have consensus to validate. You don't have consensus to change. You'll have to have it for validation. It's required to keep that entry, that token, that registry for being known to be true. But changing it is, I don't think anybody's doing that right now. And if they are, they're trying to do it. If you kind of get in the arguments about the split on some of the blockchains right now for the Bitcoin stuff because of the thefts that happen of Bitcoins, not from a blockchain, but from somebody's wallet. That's a big fight that's out there. But just to come back to the point, we believe in the next 3 years you will start to see this actually in the market, going after kind of the whole, your identification is something that you own, that you're able to aggregate, that you're able to have better control over, that you'll be able to personalize things and actually offer out in the market yourself as if you're looking for a loan instead of you just applying for a loan. Imagine if you could describe yourself as, you get the Credit Karma. Look at me, my credit score is improving and I'm doing a dang good job at it. It's like there are 18 other facts about you that have nothing to do with your FICO score that are very, very valuable on how you're seen financially. And I'm a little financially biased because that's what I do right now. But, you want to be able to explain to somebody who you are. There are products being built today that will allow you to do that. So your rent you pay. You don't get a credit score for that. Why can't you? Right? You're dealing with school. You're paying for school out of your own pocket. Why can't you make that a credit-worthy mechanism? So as you think about blockchains, think about them less about technology. Think about them, those 4 things again. Single source of the truth, immutable, incredibly secure. You can put a smart contract in front of them so you can do interesting things with them. Not you, but people who will bring you services that you care to have. But it starts becoming very, very much not a better way, but a more transparent way of describing you or other services more holistically and safely and securely. So lending, obviously, identification, I probably wore that welcome out. And some of the data sharing, some of the voting systems are going to blockchain. You record your vote, put it in a blockchain, make it immutable. You're going to buy a car, put the VIN number and the ownership into a blockchain, make it immutable. States are starting to use it for things like, did you pay your income taxes? So you will see it start to move into that again. It's complex, valuable, and very, very much aiming at mostly not between large institutions, but more on an individual basis. You'll read a lot about payments and banks doing things with payments. That's just a clearer way to record payment handling between 2 banks. It's kind of just improving the same thing that's there. It's not creating something of additional value, except for those 2 parties. So let me stop there, open it up for questions.
And I'll let you pick the questions as you go. I'll have to moderate.
Well, this isn't Ask Me Anything, so what the heck? Yes.
There's microphones here too on the sides if you want to.
Go ahead. Oh, easy.
Hi, my name is Sid. I'm a student at UW-Madison. So in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that Bitcoin is like the US dollar. I completely disagree with that statement because fundamentally there are two differences that makes Bitcoin different from traditional fiat currencies. So
Yeah.
Bitcoin has limited supply. As you know, there can be only 21 million Bitcoins ever in existence. But with the US dollar, you could theoretically print how much ever you want. The Fed has power to do that. So, and also, I think Bitcoin is fundamentally a censorship-resistant cash. But with fiat currencies and traditional banking system, you're sort of subject to censorship.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think a big difference in blockchains today is it's a single source of truth, but it's also decentralized. So it's a trustless system where parties have different trust boundaries. Right. They don't trust either. So could you just clarify why you think Bitcoin is like the US dollar?
Good questions, and I always respect a healthy disagreement. As I said, wasn't trying to be technically correct on most topics there to get the business point across. I think that gentleman's going to want it anyway. Why don't you just hand it to the other gentleman? Or, yeah, it'll work out. We make it easy. Pass it around. It's a baton. Throw it. It's good. Told you, I have a little bit bizarre teaching style. I did teach at University of Maryland for 2.5 years. It's the only time I've ever got laughter in any of my jokes. So back to your point. So there are very distinct differences between Bitcoins and fiat currencies. And what I would tell you is, forget Bitcoin for a minute, the digitization of currency is happening. That I do agree with. You know what? Whether it's a Bitcoin, a Litecoin, whatever the coin is, the digitization of coin is definitely underway. And I'm sure there'll be more of that conversation shortly. But so I do respect that point and agree with you on it. From a traditional system and the fact that you are probably not going to live your world on your phone, on everything you buy, that's 10, 15 years off. So how do you drive a balance between digitization or digital currency and traditional currencies? I think that's a large conversation underway right now. There are some countries actually that are starting to register digital currencies. Now in the United States, we treat it as it's an asset, not as if it's money. Yeah, it's still centralized. His point on decentralization is absolutely fair. I did not add that in the conversation, but while the ledger itself appears as a single centralized thing, it's really not. It exists in multiple copies. Now, you can make a single registry too, let's be clear. But most people do a distributed copy where there's a full copy of the encrypted ledger running out in multiple places so that you can assure that any copy gets destroyed or is not available, you can still service the request for verifying that asset. Is that a fair way of answering your question? All right, I just want to make sure. I think he had okay, good.
My question is, 3 weeks back, I read an article in Wall Street about the quantum computer.
Yes.
And what is your view on the, blockchain, the effect of the quantum on the blockchain?
There's this, quantum is an interesting thing, and I'm not going to profess to know intimately what it is because even understanding quantum is way beyond my capacity. But the raw ability to compute will change exponentially. And it's going to affect more than just a Bitcoin blockchain conversation, right? If you can get instantaneous calculations at such a low cost point, it will change the rate of this adoption here because you'll generationally leap by the raw compute power over what we're doing today. But just one small thing to bear in mind, I want to go back to your question because it's a really good one. Keep in mind, most of the applications you use today are based off of 1990s client-server or web technologies, okay? And so quantum, for example, is going to really speed up the ledger model a lot. Getting that out there, getting it in the channel, getting it working, getting it known to the regulators is probably a 7 to 10 year journey is the problem. So I think it's going to change the paradigm a lot where your phone will be able to give up even some of its computing power to something quantum.
Yeah, my concern is more on the encryption because that's what it talks about, that all this encryption which is done because it computes so fast.
It can break it.
Yeah, it will break it.
Yep.
So the trust, what blockchain is trying to bring, is going to affect that. And I'm sure the improvement will happen at the same time on the blockchain, but that's coming and making reality pretty soon.
Yep. I share an insight as personal insight, but it's kind of a well-worn path. Some entrepreneur will figure out how to make sure that whatever that encryption mechanism is, that quantum computer doesn't break it. It's kind of the whole pacing, right? But I get concerned, go back to the comment I was trying to state poorly was, all the stuff that's running today is going to be just wide open. Forget advanced blockchain. I mean, you think about traditional passwords. You could put in an 18-character password. This thing can crack it in like 2 nanoseconds or 3. I think it was a model they were using. You sit down there and make your best effort, and you hit save, and it's done. That's why I go back to identification. So it's as a foot race. How do I keep far enough ahead of you so the bear eats you instead of me, right? So we don't know what that answer is, but there's going to have to be something there. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
What's that?
This is not true. Quantum computing is not going to break all encryption. It's going to mean that key lengths need to be much bigger.
True.
Yes, passwords are a thing of the past.
I'm talking about the passwords. I agree with you on that totally.
So, but you can prove that there are physical costs to computation.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actually prove that with keys that are long enough, quantum computing is not going to break it.
Fair point. So the gentleman in the front here is saying, not quite true on breaking all encryption, because the length of the encryption key can help manage that. I would respectfully agree with that. It's just
But you still have a big problem because suddenly all of your old ledgers
all open. Yeah. And that's why I say somebody somewhere will figure out how to get in front of that. But you got to think about 99% of everything we do today is legacy. It's a massive system issue. It's a fair point. One last question, I think.
That's the same thing as with your normal currency.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at your normal, so when color computers came in, there was suddenly a huge bunch of fraudulent dollar bills,
Right.
and then the dollar bills were changed so that just using a color computer or color printer, you wouldn't be able to pass them on.
Put in the stripes, put in the alternate colors.
You need to do something.
Right.
You need to do something by taking all of the old dollar bills out and putting new ones in.
Which is our problem, is how do you migrate what we have?
Which is his fault, which is what he's asking about.
Yeah.
All right, at this point, unfortunately, we have to move on to our next speaker, so we'll have time to interact after the sessions are over. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, everyone. Very, very, very helpful. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be up here from Chicago. So unfortunately, Jennifer O'Rourke was not able to join us from Illinois, but I just want to say that's actually the reason I'm here, was the connection through Jennifer. And so if you are interested in connecting with her, maybe we can talk during break, because the Illinois Blockchain Initiative is a state government initiative. She's an employee of the state of Illinois, and we've partnered together on a number of initiatives. We also have the Chicago Blockchain Initiative and a number of other things happening in Illinois. And so if you're interested in that piece of what's happening, I'd be happy to talk to you during break. Should I switch this over? All right, great. Well, David was saying that Mark is a tough act to follow. And what I like about the connection between us is that I think we have different perspectives. So Mark, working for Fiserv, is in industry, has, I would say, a practical perspective, talking about implementation, some of the work that they're doing. I'm going to take a more idealistic perspective, academic, if you will. That's where I am. I'm from DePaul University, but universities like Marquette, DePaul, around the country are now getting very interested in blockchain. And I think all of us agree that we need to be preparing our students for this emerging technology. I don't want to send students out into the workforce only for them to find out a few years later that their skill set is outdated. And so I'm integrating this into my classroom. We're developing curriculum at DePaul. I think they're looking into it here at Marquette. And so it's just great to be developing this partnership. So as I said, my perspective is slightly different than Mark's, partly because I want to start with Bitcoin and I think kind of emphasize Bitcoin. Bitcoin, some people love it. You know, it's now trading above $7,000. Some of you who follow this, there was a discussion about a hard fork that's now been dropped. You know, some people love Bitcoin. Some people are like, oh, it's just like money laundering and drugs. And I'm actually still a believer in Bitcoin because I believe this is why we're here. I don't think we would be having a blockchain conference if it wasn't for Bitcoin. And so I want to start there and kind of give you some perspective. My talk is almost educational. You know, I'm guessing some of you are here because you're kind of like, what is blockchain? And so Mark gave you some kind of, I think, very nice summary bullet points. I want to kind of slow down and kind of start from a few fundamentals, give you a little bit of the history, and then towards the end talk about how this is ramping up and evolving, because there are a lot of very recent developments, and I think it's moving very quickly. But I think it's important to step back kind of as an academic and understand some of the foundations for this. So thinking about the birth of Bitcoin, where did this start? So there's this gentleman or pseudonym, Satoshi Nakamoto, you might have heard of, and there was a white paper in November 2008. Now, many people have heard about this white paper. They've heard about Nakamoto, but I would guess many of you have not actually read this white paper. This white paper is out there publicly available. It's like less than 10 pages, and it's very well written, very concise, and I would encourage you to actually read this paper, because if you want to understand this, you know, blockchain, Bitcoin, you can go to Twitter, you can go to, you know, all these other sources, and there's a lot of talking points now. I'd encourage you to go to the source document. Just read it for yourself. And so the title of his white paper is Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. I'm going to say that again, because what I'm going to do is basically deconstruct that title through my talk. A peer-to-peer electronic cash system. So the opening line of this white paper, sentence 1, commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. So what's so interesting about this combination of Mark and me up here is that Mark, coming from Fiserv, working with financial institutions, his clients are banks. And so he's trying to help banks figure out blockchain and how they can integrate blockchain into the existing financial system through traditional commercial banking. What's interesting about this white paper is it basically says this is a legacy system, and Bitcoin wants to replace that system. So that's disruption with a capital D. You know, there's a lot of talk now about how maybe it's not going to be disruptive, maybe it's going to be transformative. Because a lot of people, when Bitcoin and blockchain first came out, they said, oh man, this is like the death of banking. And it was a paradigm shift. But what we're seeing is a lot more partnerships. We're seeing banks developing private blockchains, bank consortiums like R3. But I want to step back. I know where things are and where they've been going. I want to step back and think about where did this idea begin, and as sort of like a first principle. And this first principle was, can we have a payment system that does not involve trusted third parties? That's why we're here today. Blockchain is trying to develop payments without a middleman. That is disintermediation. That's not banks. That's not other types of financial institutions. It is peer-to-peer. That's why I think Bitcoin is so beautiful. And I just want to remind us of that. Think about this date, November 2008. When was the bankruptcy of Lehman? September of that same year. This is the heart of the global financial crisis. This is not by accident, I don't think, that's when Bitcoin launched and that's why it took off. Because if you think about replacing these third-party, trusted third parties, think about the crisis. Banks are failing. They're being bailed out by the government. My background is with the Fed. I was in DC during this period. Massive expansion of the money supply. Quantitative easing, many would argue a debasement of the US currency. And then it started to spread globally. Everybody dropping to rock bottom interest rates, trying to just flood the economy with liquidity. Do we still trust sovereign currency? Mark held up the US dollar. That is still the global standard, the reserve currency. But Bitcoin is basically saying, is that what we want to trust? The good faith and credit of the US government? Or is there a different way? And that's what I think makes this so interesting, because the crisis was ultimately a broken trust. And so Bitcoin and blockchain is trying to think, is there a different way to think about trust other than doing it through a third party? Okay? And so if you think about this conceptually, let's think about this phrase, electronic cash. And so I teach money and banking, undergraduate and graduate at DePaul in Chicago. One of the things we talk about are what are the characteristics of money? What is the definition of money? And so if you read a textbook, you'll often see a store of value and a means of payment. Now there's a lot of legal uncertainty and disputes about whether Bitcoin is money or whether it's an asset. And there's been certain cases and decisions on this, but it's interesting that some people have now sort of wanted to just decide, oh, it's not money, it's just an asset. Now you can sort of base that on certain legal decisions, but think about the white paper, electronic cash. So you can be all about trading cryptocurrencies. Many of my students are trading Bitcoin, Ethereum, other cryptocurrencies. This is a huge thing now in Chicago with prop traders. But ultimately, Bitcoin's origin was more so as money, not as a financial asset. And so if you think about the history of money, think about gold. People start, when we moved away from barter, people started digging these shiny rocks out of the ground and saying, this thing has value. There's nothing inherently valuable about gold. You can transmit a little bit of electricity and things like that, but it's just shiny. That's why we like it. And there's not much of it. Limited supply. I have a shiny rock. You don't. Now this shiny rock has value because you want what I have. Well, the governments, sovereign nations like Rome, started to figure out, hey, let's coin this stuff. Let's take these precious metals and beat them into little small discs that people can carry around in their pocket, and let's use that as money. Well, precious metals are expensive, coinage is expensive. At some point in the history of money, we decided, okay, well, maybe we don't actually need the rock beaten into a small coin. Maybe we could just print a piece of paper out of wood pulp and then just say that that thing is somehow backed by this shiny rock. And so you get currency on the gold standard. That was the US dollar, that piece of paper. Up until the 1970s, the US dollar, the value was backed by gold. It was Richard Nixon who finally said, you know what, I'm going to break that linkage. We are going off the gold standard, and the US dollar became a true fiat currency. What is fiat currency? A currency that only has value based on faith. Trust. If you think the US dollar is real money, it's wood pulp, backed by a sovereign nation. And so your faith is ultimately in the US government. And so, I sometimes push back on students when they think about these pieces of paper as being real money, because it's ultimately monopoly money. And so the idea of Bitcoin as being somehow not money, I think it's a mental shift. And so in the evolution of this money, we went from gold to coins to fiat currency, ultimately into electronic payments. You know, most of you probably don't carry around much cash. You know, I joke with my students, I'm now like a hipster like them. I carry my wallet in my front pocket, not in my back, and it's like a few millimeters in width. My dad's wallet, it's like you pull it out of the back, and it's like this huge thing, got all these cards and, you know, bills. It's partly generational. And so we're used to paying through electronics, but the question is, I want to ask, are electronic payments still money? Because as soon as you start talking about the evolution into the digital economy and electronic payments, now you're talking about the payment system. And so this is something that's been around for years now. Developed countries, and now many developing countries, are becoming cashless societies. Sweden is one of the countries furthest on this frontier. I think it's like 95% of the payments in Sweden are electronic. They just don't carry around physical pieces of krona anymore. And so electronic payments are now the common means of payment, but what exactly are we talking about? Well, I think we're talking about credit cards and debit cards. You know, I went to like one of these food trucks last night. They've got Square. That used to be why I carried $20 bills, so I could buy stuff on the street. With Square, I don't need that. They just swipe my credit card. And so all of these things are going to electronic payments. But I would say, well, wait, credit cards, credit, that's not cash. Some of my students think it is. You know, they think it's like almost like free money. That is a debt contract. Different. Credit, not cash. Well, debit cards, you could say, well, you know, I don't want to run up a credit card balance. I'm going to be physically astute. I'm going to use my debit card instead. Debit still requires a bank account. And so, you know, when you pay for something at a point of sale system, there's a delay because they have to run it through the payment system, check whether your account has sufficient balance, and then it's approved, and you can walk off with your merchandise. That verification process is ultimately going through this thing called the automated clearinghouse, which is the legacy payment system that is an interbank market. And so all of us have accounts at different banks. And so if you want to buy something, you have to have this network of settlement and clearing among all those different banks. That's our current system for payments. I would argue that cashless societies are actually heavily intermediated. This really only struck me recently. I'm a banking guy. I'm in the finance department. My background is banking research. I love banking. But there's still this idea I think we have that as we evolve as societies, as individuals, this idea of the cashless society that's kind of almost being held out there, you might think of that as this sort of like beautiful sort of just peer-to-peer thing where like everybody can just, it's very flat and horizontal and everyone's just sort of interacting and paying on this surface. But our current cashless society is full of third-party intermediaries. That's the banking system. Now, I would argue that what Mark is trying to do is helping the banking system evolve and adapt. And I think that's very important, and I think they need to, because there's a lot of inefficiencies and insecurities in this current market, and so banks doing blockchain could certainly help. But I think Bitcoin and this white paper isn't about improving the existing system. It's about replacing it. Is it possible to actually have trustless transactions? This is a paradigm shift. This is a different philosophical perspective. And I would argue that Bitcoin is a form of electronic cash, not electronic payments, electronic cash that allows for true peer-to-peer transactions. Now, the innovation of Bitcoin is that electronic cash is actually quite difficult. You know, we had the internet and people started buying stuff on the internet. Well, the immediate innovation that actually came out of eBay was PayPal. PayPal birthed out of eBay because they needed a way for people to pay each other on the internet. And you could say, well, PayPal, that's great. It's this startup, it's this innovation, but it's actually just taking the legacy system and figuring out a way to connect it to the internet, all these bank accounts and transactions. Bitcoin is a different approach. It says, well, let's just start from scratch, take a digitally native approach, and say, how can we do payments on the internet without all these institutions? The immediate problem that you run into is something called the double spend problem. So the beauty of cash as coin or paper is that as soon as I give it to you to pay for something, I no longer have it. And so it's traceable and trackable. That transaction is irreversible because now it's in your pocket and not in mine. But if this thing is electronic, what's to prevent me from counterfeiting it or duplicating it? You know, if I can take a dollar bill, make a photocopy, and hold on to the photocopy and give you the piece of paper, but somehow still use this photocopy, that would be a double spend. And I think one analogy is to think about Napster. Think about the 1990s. That was a P2P file sharing service for music. What did it immediately run into? Copyright infringement. You have these MP3 files that are just proliferating, and now you no longer have ownership or property rights. That's the problem on the internet. Stuff just gets copied and proliferated. So how do you have electronic cash on the internet? Well, that's the white paper. Trying to develop a system for electronic transactions without relying on trust. How do you solve the double spend problem? Here I want to take a few minutes to slow down and give you 3 slides on the Nakamoto white paper. This first one's Blockchain 101. So this is what I teach my students in the business school. I have finance students, not computer science students. I need to help them kind of understand this. And so I think, and Mark touched on many of these points, but I just want, again, going back to the source document. We define a coin as a chain of digital signatures. Think about that. That's a bit of a mind bend. A lot of people think Bitcoin, and they start to think, oh, it's like digital gold, or they start to think that it's this, if you read stories on the internet, there's often actually pictures of these shiny things with a B, kind of like a dollar. We tend to think of it as just dollars in cyberspace. Bitcoins, as originated in this white paper, are actually a series of digital signatures on a chain. Chain. Think about where this is headed. So the question is, how do you prevent double spend? Digital signatures are great, but I could sign it to one party and then sign it to a second party, and neither would know the difference. It's almost like 2 liens on the same property. That's very problematic because now you don't have a clear record of ownership. Well, the way Bitcoin solves this problem is in really 2 steps. First is that the transactions must be publicly announced. This, I think, was the real innovation. Rather than transactions being private and then trying to secure that information, which is what we do in our current system, let's make it public. Let's put it on the web itself. And so many people, when they think about transactions, they think about security in the sense of like, let me put it on my server and try and keep everybody else out. This is, let's put it out there publicly so that everyone can see it. And then step 2, a system for participants to agree on a single history. And so if we want to verify these transactions, we need to have everyone agree on what that history of those transactions are, okay? That's about the level I would do with business school students. Our computer science department, my colleagues, Corin Pitcher, Massimo DePiero, they're teaching this more from the cryptographic perspective. Because cryptocurrency is ultimately about cryptography. And so this peer-to-peer system is a distributed timestamp server. Distributed, public, timestamp series of transactions out there in this public space. And so the transfer of these coins is actually what's most important. Because you have a hashing, which is a verification of those transactions, and you have public keys for the next owner rather than all of everything being private. Now, I would argue that this approach is unique in that it is so public. And so this, the word blockchain does not appear in that white paper. But see this last quote. Nodes, which are these participants in the network, express their acceptance of the block by working on creating the next block in the chain. And so as these transactions are publicly announced, as they are publicly verified, the chain is produced, and you now have a secure, immutable history of ownership. That's blockchain. And so we can sort of trash Bitcoin as being this sort of fly-by-night. Jamie Dimon recently called it a scam. I think it was what put blockchain on the map, and I think it's what really brought us here today. Now, let me say a couple more things right here. There are a lot of different blockchains. Mark mentioned some of that. There are private blockchains and public blockchains. I'm actually a big believer in public blockchains. Now, it's very risky and unsure for people who are actually trying to implement this. I get that. But many of the private blockchains, they use the word consensus, but it's actually consensus among administrators. Notice the example that he gave. For instance, like a classroom with grades. He said, in order for those grades to be verified, it would be a consensus among 4 administrators, not among the students themselves. I would argue that is basically like a middle ground between our legacy system and this true peer-to-peer verification system. It is a consensus based on governance, whereas consensus in this model is the actual participants are the ones building that consensus. It's public. It's not, there are no rights that are granted or taken away. Anyone can participate. And that's, I think, the real innovation in blockchain. Now, let me just touch on some applications, a little bit in finance, and then how to connect this back to academia. So Mark mentioned many of these. There's a lot of transactions that are being moved towards the blockchain. I think one of the most interesting ones are cross-border transactions, because the legacy payment systems tend to be sovereign in nature. They tend to follow borders. The US and Europe with a big ocean in between. Blockchain is perfect for crossing those types of boundaries. And what's ironic, I think, a little bit is JP Morgan. Dimon, slams Bitcoin, but then turns around and is using blockchain and Quorum based on Ethereum for these cross-border transactions. NASDAQ is now putting a lot of their clearing on the blockchain with the help of Chain. This is also super interesting in terms of small transactions. One thing that's great about blockchain is it makes existing stuff more efficient. The thing I get more excited about is it creates opportunities to do things that you cannot do in the current system. If you have a 3% transaction fee, you cannot do small transactions profitably. That's why if you go to some of these local mom and pop stores, if you're buying something less than $5, they don't want a credit card. Because Visa and MasterCard are taking their profit margin. If you have blockchain, you can now do much smaller transactions efficiently. Internet of Things is perfectly wedded to this type of small transactions, small transaction fees. Auditing. I think accounting is ripe for disintermediation. I was actually recently interviewed for an article by the Illinois CPA Society. This is all about how do we verify information. That's what auditors do. Well, if you put that stuff on the blockchain, I think some of those people are going to be out of a job. Data and security. This is a new paradigm for storing information. If you start thinking about Ethereum and some of these other developments in blockchain, it's really a different data management system. Rather than having two separate servers and trying to figure out how to get them to talk to each other, let's create a distributed ledger to store that information. Property rights, real estate, vehicle title. Mark touched on those. I would say land rights. One of the things I get most excited about is what does this do in emerging markets where people don't have the ability to verify ownership of their own land? This is where I think people's lives will begin to be changed. It's not just about now I only pay 1% instead of 3%. It's like farmers can now own their own land, and that can be verified on a blockchain. Super transformative. Let me touch on crypto and ICOs. So I don't have much time here, but one of the hot things now in finance is initial coin offerings. This is a very new market, and a lot of people are very skeptical. I think there's some interesting stuff here because crowdfunding has developed through many different phases. People were very skeptical of crowdfunding, which is basically rather than having the big boys give you money, let's get lots of people to give us a little bit of money and pool it together. Very democratic. Blockchain, I think, encouraged that type of democratic nature. So I think we've kind of moved from like Kickstarter into sort of like crowdfunded equity with the Jobs Act. ICOs are, I think, super interesting because it is a coin offering, but you were using it to raise money. You were raising money by creating money. That might sound like voodoo magic. I think for some of these companies it is. But for legit companies, they're issuing these coins that can actually function in their ecosystem and I think provide value both to investors and to participants. And so I'm running out of time, so let me close with this slide. One reason I'm here today is because of the blockchain community. I hope my comments were somewhat helpful from an educational perspective. Part of my goal here is also to make connections. Because, some people would say innovation happens on the coast. Peter Thiel was in Chicago about a year or two ago, came in from Silicon Valley and said, if you're interested in innovation and you're in the Midwest, you should leave now. He just like totally trashed us. And people in Chicago, I would argue, people in Milwaukee, we want to kind of stand up and be like, hey, there's cool stuff happening here. And it's not just sort of, I think, trying to toot our own horn. Think about the history of Chicago and financial innovation. Futures and derivatives exchanges, CME, Chicago Board Options Exchange, that's Midwest. Those two exchanges are in a race to issue Bitcoin futures by the end of the year. And so we have a history of financial innovation in the Midwest. We've got tons of innovative universities. The fact that Marquette is doing this conference, the fact that they reached out to me at DePaul. We have students from UW-Madison, UW-Whitewater. This is happening here. And I think we need that type of collaboration. So I think Chicago plus Milwaukee, that's where we see awesome things happen. one final sort of anecdote. So Rosalind from UW-Madison, she and I met this summer in Chicago at DePaul at a smart contracts coding boot camp. We had students from Illinois Institute of Tech, University of Chicago, UW-Madison. If students in universities can start to collaborate, if we can start to connect with those of you in industry, Fiserv, startups, that's when I think we're really going to see this technology take off. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your time. And just to forewarn you, I like to try and do this lightning. So keep your questions quick. I'll keep my answers quick so we can try and get through as many as we can. Yes, sir. Great question. I'm not sure that mic is on. So he was asking about physical connections and Bitcoin. So you mentioned ATMs. Some of my friends in Chicago run a company called Digital Mint that is a Bitcoin ATM network. You mentioned wearables. A lot of this, and Mark touched on this, is about identification and biometrics. I think people are now sort of integrating that into watches and phones. And so as you think about biometrics, rather than using a passcode, rather than using my thumb, I'm now using my face with iPhone 10. If you can now connect that to the underlying information about me on a blockchain, then the level of security really ramps up. So I think, again, Internet of Things, phones, watches, it's not about connecting my credit card through Apple Pay. It's about connecting physical, either phones or other devices, to this immutable technology.
Could it be a note, though? Could it be a tangible?
I don't see that happening. I think it's digitally native, and I think that's where it should stay. Yes, ma'am.
You stated at the beginning of your speech, and thank you so much for doing this, this is wonderful, that the dollar is part of its value because it's backed by a sovereign nation. However, where does the value of Bitcoin come from? From what I can see, it is simply what one person is willing to sell it for and what one person is willing to buy it for.
That's called a free market. Well, indeed. I'm not joking, but like, that's the value. It's supply and demand. That's the beauty of it. There is nobody saying, let's centralize this and control it. I would say that's socialism. Capitalism, I would say this is the currency of capitalism. Is that fair?
And I agree with you. I actually own Bitcoin, but I'm wondering what happens if I go to my Coinbase account and it's gone. What do I call?
That's a security issue. I think there are, cold storage. There's a lot of solutions that are being developed for trying to prevent hacking. I think hacking is much worse in the legacy system than in the new system, but there's still some things that they have to figure out. Thank you. Rosalind.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this talk. I have a question about academia. I think a lot of times stuff, particularly in the financial world, the businesses are really pushing stuff forward. And I'm curious how you think we can keep academia pushing on the front of that as well.
Great question. Academia, I think, tends to lag industry. I don't think, ideally we could help lead through research, thought leadership, but at a minimum, I think we should be partnering. And so I think, yeah. I think that's Marquette and DePaul's strong suits. We are not ivory towers. DePaul, downtown. Marquette, downtown. Build these labs, get students and entrepreneurs working together. That's, I think, where we're going to see results. Thank you. Sorry, buddy, you got to get in line if you want to jump in.
Thank you so much. I'm really jazzed about what you presented today. I've been in Bitcoin since it was $5. And,
good for you.
Anyway, and yeah, I happened to be out in Silicon Valley at the time, so it was, I was trying to send messages back to Milwaukee. Everybody I could, you need to get into this stuff and buy it because it's just going to take over the world. I'm founding a company called Remedy Coin, kind of an NGO, and what we're going to do is take ICOs and base them on claims. We'll authenticate, appraise, take these things, like instances that have happened to me of police brutality, where I can't get any remedy in the courts because the lawyers won't take your case when your case is against the government. In a city where it's so tyrannical that the lawyers are afraid. So what what I think is interesting, I started seeing companies starting to tokenize debt instruments, like loans and so forth.
Okay.
So I'm working on this concept of building out like a bunch of notaries, witnesses, and serving the process against entities, maybe a city government or something.
So what you're doing sounds interesting. It sounds a little too complex for this type of interaction. If we could talk during the break.
Right.
Because to me, that's social entrepreneurship. And I think blockchain isn't just about how do we make more money. It's like, how do we solve more problems? So I think it's super interesting. We've got a few more questions I got to get through. So yes, sir.
Hi, thanks again for coming. I'm a student here at Marquette, so really appreciate you having me.
Thank you for being here.
And kind of going off the previous gentleman's question, he kind of said Bitcoin, going to take over the world. And I thought you having a background at the Fed, this would be a good question. And I wrote it down, so sorry, I'm going to read it off my phone here, so don't forget. So are central banks and federal governments going to fight the onset of cryptocurrencies to remain in positions of power as trusted third parties, and especially the United States being the world's reserve currency? And if so, like what kind of steps would that entail? And I just read an article this week about Singapore issuing its own digital currencies. Is that a potential solution?
Great question. And yes, I would say it's very similar to financial institutions, private banks. They view this as a potential outside threat, and so they think about how do we either pivot or adapt or even adopt. And so many of the central banks are now talking about issuing central bank-backed digital currency. And Singapore is an example. Sweden is another example. The Fed, I don't see that happening, but the Fed, I think, is trying to understand this. They've written there's a Federal Reserve white paper called Distributed Ledger Technologies, where you could kind of get the Fed's perspective on this technology. But what's interesting, so we had a governor from the Riksbank, the Swedish central bank, in Chicago in the spring talking about this very thing. They're talking about issuing something called an e-krona. And it was kind of boggling to me, sort of, why would a central bank do this? What is the point? But what they're trying to do is they're so worried that Sweden has gone cashless that now you can't make payments unless you have a bank account. That starts to look very close to an oligopoly. And their concern is, what is that third outside option? Because right now, it's physical pieces of paper. I can't go to Epic Burger in Chicago and pay with cash. Argo Tea, I cannot pay with cash. There are stores that are now going cashless. What about the unbanked? They are now totally severed from those sale systems. And so we need to be thinking about this, and central banks are thinking about this. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a partnership, and I don't think they're trying to dig in their heels. I think we'll figure it out together. So thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I saw on your slide that you had a smart contract in quotes. So the connectivity problem right now between real-world transactions and projects contained on the blockchain. So my thought is, what are your thoughts on projects like smartcontract.com? The product is Chainlink, and how they are creating a decentralized Oracle network, and they're working with SGX, Town Crier. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
So great question. I'm a huge fan of smart contracts. I think there's a lot of legal uncertainties. This whole question of, is the code the law? But I think many lawyers are now trying to engage with this and sort of having lawyers actually writing the smart contracts, but then it creates this sort of automated, immutable script that can then transfer value and other things. So my talk was primarily focused on money and currency, I think smart contracts are sort of 2.0 in sort of how do we think about other types of value, like property, like real estate, and how, if you want to transfer value, could you do that through a smart contract? And so I'm a big believer in that. Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, if you look back over the last few decades, one thing that all government administrations in our country, regardless of party, have been doing is they have been stamping out the ability to own or transfer wealth anonymously. I mean, when you look at, they leaned on Switzerland to get rid of the secret accounts. If you deposit more than $10,000, you get, so there's all these things happening to prevent that. And with all these cryptocurrencies, they are creating that ability. And it's not just Bitcoin. With hundreds of them, it's impossible for the government to keep track of, somebody's coin being used. Don't you think at some point the government is going to say, we've done everything we can to stamp out anonymous transfer of wealth. Now all this is proliferating and it's creating what we tried to destroy. Don't you think they're going to just clamp down on it and say, no more?
So China is trying to do that. So I think you're right, because in China, this was proliferating, centralized planners, fear it's threatening, they shut that down. I think in the US and other developed markets, I think it is this sort of, I think regulators are concerned. And so the SEC has issued statements on ICOs and saying, if these are securities, they fall under securities law and have to be regulated as such. But I would say, part of there's a trade-off very often between security and privacy. And so as we want to make financial systems more secure, we typically give up privacy. And I would say part of what makes countries like the US great is the respect for privacy. And so I think if we can continue this, I think some of these creative solutions will help figure out those trade-offs more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick question.
Thank you. But thank you, Lamont. That was great.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.